Hey everyone, Robert here, author of Expansion Mastery, the practical guide to living a fully engaged life. Are you ready to start living your life to the fullest? Are you ready and willing to transform yourself and your life from ordinary to extraordinary? Welcome, my friends, to the Fully Engaged Life. Welcome back to the show, everyone. In the previous episode, I gave a greater in-depth explanation of what this training of mindfulness actually is. And from this, we can clearly discern that mindfulness is not something that fits a Western definition. That is just the best term that they could translate this type of training into. I find one of the biggest problems students and clients have with this type of spiritual training or spiritual practice is that they try to associate the terms for these things according to the Western definitions or Western understanding or their own understanding, and none of which is correct. So if we grasp the fact that a lot of these texts were translated from Sanskrit and Pali and other languages, they don't really have any way of being translated directly into English. So they come up with the best term they can. But English does not allow it to be accurately translated. And that's why I'm explaining this, to help you better grasp what this mindfulness training is and just how incredibly important it is. This mindfulness training is one of the things that can help us have a form of protection for our mental health in several ways. It also creates the foundation and opens the door towards awakening or enlightenment. In addition to this, it is also the foundation for being capable of living a fully engaged life. Another important aspect in developing the state of being known as mindfulness are the practices of being mindful of the mind. These practices help us become mindful, having this heightened sense of conscious awareness for the mind itself, for the workings of the mind, for the processes going on in the mind, for the differentiation between the conscious mind and the subconscious mind, so we can understand what programs, what processes are going on unconsciously. In other words, we don't know that they are happening. These practices allow us to engage those things in a very direct way. And in so doing, we bring these unconscious mental processes, or these processes that are constantly going on in the background of our mind, in our subconscious mind, into our conscious mind, in where we become aware of them. We're consciously aware of them, and we can actually engage them. And this gives us a hint as to how can the mind be mindfully aware of itself. And this is the important question that we must come to ask. How can the mind be aware of itself? It's just like if we have a thought or an emotion, and we're able to observe that thought or emotion as it arises, then who is having the thought and who is doing the observing? These are the questions that this type of practice is able to answer for us. So in the actual formal teachings, this encourages us to understand when our mind is with anger, filled with anger, and when our mind is not filled with anger. And this may seem easy, and it's simple, but it's definitely far from easy. To be constantly aware of such goings on in the mind. So we need to be aware when the mind is angry. We need to be aware when it is upset. We need to be aware when it is happy. We also need to be aware when it is without any of those things. Then it goes deeper to understand when our mind is in delusion and when it is not in delusion, when it is without delusion, free of delusion. We also have to know if the mind is distracted or if it is without distraction, because this is the idea. We fall for these things again and again until we are capable of being consciously aware of them at every moment. And then this goes deeper into making sure we understand how these things arise, how they fall, how they affect us, and then we have to engage them and work with them so then we can minimize or do away with anger in the mind, and we can cut through all of the delusion, and we can make sure that we don't succumb to the weakness of distraction. And of course, in the formal teachings, they refer to something I covered in a previous podcast called the three poisons. And what this teaching has done is taken all of the negativity of the mind and condensed it all into three basic type of categories. And these are known as the unwholesome roots of the mind, or the three poisons. The first one usually relates to greed. The second one relates to anger and hatred. And the third relates to ignorance and delusion. So within the practice of becoming mindful of the mind, one of the things that it's trying to help us accomplish is to become aware of these unwholesome roots of the mind, so we can understand them and hopefully, through the practices, minimize their effects, lessen how often they arise, and eventually step outside of them altogether. So through recognizing these three poisons or unwholesome roots of the mind, once we escape them, even for just a little while, then in the absence of those things, we get to experience more positive aspects of our mind, through which we experience a sense of relief from that negativity, and we are able to feel how great it feels to have this more positive state of mind. Naturally, this has an incredible impact on us on a vibrational level as well. So the first part is to engage in practices that allow us to understand that these three unwholesome aspects of the mind, or these three poisons, are truly there. You don't take anyone's word for it in spirituality. You experience it directly for yourself. And the practices are designed to open the doorway that allow you to go in and see how these things are arising in your mind at any given time. In this way, you are able to recognize the truth of the matter, the fact that they are indeed there, and you get to observe them, understand what triggers them, what causes them to arise, what does it feel like when they're there, and then watch as they fall away. You get to determine whether it's truly you or if it's arising from something else. And in so doing, you discover how the human mind actually works. And you become capable of understanding your own mind. And as I always point out, make sure that when you notice these things arising, notice that maybe they're present more than you'd like to admit, that you do not allow yourself to become frustrated. You do not allow yourself to judge yourself. The idea is to observe, to understand, to directly experience without judgment. Because all too often, when we succumb to the distraction of this type of self-judgment, it creates a sense of unhappiness within us, lowering our vibration, frustration, which prevents us from continuing further. We create a self-sabotaging block, or it causes us to cease the process altogether just because we don't like what we see. And we have to be very careful because this is where we start to pose a bit of a threat to our own ego. So it's incredibly important when engaging the actual practices of becoming mindful of the mind that we do so without a sense of judgment, that we do so with simply a sense of curiosity and observation. We're just trying to understand how this works so that we can make the necessary changes through the practices. We have to remember, we have the practices. We've been given these specific practices in order to help us see these things and then help us to fix them as well. So we've got the answers. We got everything we need. There's no reason to become frustrated or upset with ourselves. That is extremely detrimental to your progress. I'd like to offer a dose of reality here. I mean, all we have to do is look around anywhere in the world right now, and we can see just how messed up the human mind is. I mean, look around. Look at the things that are taking place right now. Look at how much anger and hatred there is in the world. Look at how much delusion and ignorance there is in the world, as well as the incredible amount of greed taking place. We can see that these three poisons of the mind have risen greatly over the past 5 to 10 years, but they have always been present in the human mind. They have always been a problem. For over 2,600 years, it has been noted that these things are a problem and that they need to be overcome. And this is the training that was developed successfully, which allows us to do just that. And then as we engage these practices, through observing how various thoughts and emotions arise in the mind, we can get to the intention or motivation behind those things. And then we can learn to work with our intention as well. And this is something that is vitally important in spirituality, in martial arts, in anything where you are looking to correct and have the ability to have control over your own mind, as opposed to the mind being controlled by the ego. Because we can't always control the outcome of our thoughts, words, and actions, but we can be in conscious control and consciously aware of the intention behind them. And these practices allow us to escape the negative charge behind the intention of our thoughts, words, and actions. It also allows us to be mindfully aware of what is behind our intention, the emotional charge of our intention, instead of our thoughts, words, and actions being mindless to where we're not even aware why we're thinking those things, saying those things, or doing certain things. We don't even understand our own intention or motivation behind any of those things. You see, these practices allow us to become very consciously aware, very mindful of not only our thoughts, words, and actions, but the intention, the motivation behind those things. This set of practices even allows us to understand when our mind is in a state of withdrawal. And what I'm referring to here as withdrawal is when you get stuck in your head, right? I've been talking about this as well. And these practices where we become mindful of the mind, we become aware when our mind has done that, when we get stuck in our head and we disconnect from everything around us. Because when this happens with the mind, it strengthens the impact, it strengthens the power that the ego has over the mind. And most of the time, this is a very unconscious thing. People are just simply not aware that this is happening, that they're doing this. So we have to become aware of any moment where the mind is retreating like that, where it's withdrawing from a state of consciousness and it's retreating into the state of unconsciousness in your head, where you're just all stuck in your head. And nowhere do I see this to the extent as when people are looking at these screens, their little phone screen, their computer screen, which causes a greater and greater divide, a greater and greater disconnection between your mind and your body. Your mind and your body are supposed to be linked into one whole unit. Things like this, where our mind is retreating or withdrawing and getting stuck in my head, every time that happens, it causes a greater and greater sense of disconnection between my mind and my body. This too allows the ego to grow even greater. This is why the ego is attaining such unsustainable levels out there, and we're seeing such devastating levels of twisted logic and just outright evil thoughts, words, and actions in the world. Because those things are generally the product of the ego. So we have to be able to become aware of when the mind retreats back into itself like this. We have to be aware of that. Likewise, these practices help us understand when our mind has become distracted. Because again, for many people, they're not even aware that this is happening. They are not aware that they are even distracted. So we can see through this incredible separation of the mind and body, and from the mind retreating back in itself, it makes it even easier for us to become distracted. We become distracted by our own thoughts, by our own delusion, by our own ignorance. We also become distracted by an endless barrage of information and entertainment given to us from the external world. And it's critical to understand that this serves one thing. It takes you farther and farther from the state of being we call mindfulness. And each time that your mind succumbs to the distractions, it becomes weaker. And you become more separated from any state of mindfulness, increasing your state of mindlessness. So these practices then allow us to recognize when these things are happening and to stop them instead of mindlessly giving in and going along with it when we don't even realize that's what's happening. Another distraction or aspect of the mind here that we can look at as an example is how the mind creates a story for everything instantly in order to assess the world around us. The mind loves to jump towards making up stories to explain things that it doesn't have any factual information for whatsoever. Now, it does also serve the purpose of creating truthful stories, but more often than not, these stories that it creates, based on nothing than our own conjecture and fantasy, and it has been researched and noted that this actually takes place in the left side of our brain, and I've done entire episodes on the science and understanding of this sort of thing as well. But these stories, the process of the mind that develops these stories, is another process of the mind. There are so many unconscious processes happening in the mind that you don't even realize, you're not aware is happening in the background of your mind. And we have to be able to bring these things to the forefront and observe them without judgment in order to begin working with them directly and making positive changes in them. If my memory serves, I also did an entire episode a while ago where I outlined several of these processes that we're unconscious of, these mental processes that are taking place in the subconscious mind. But it is through the actual authentic practices of mindfulness that allow us to escape the mindlessness of the mind and experience a sense of mental and emotional freedom and well-being. So we can see these practices are a type of mind training that allow us to discipline and strengthen our mind. And there are so many more. This is just an overview to give you an idea of what's going on here and what we need to address. I mean, think about it. Let's work our way back. If we have a mind that is constantly giving way to distraction, that lets us know that our mind is very weak and lazy. How can we hope to accomplish anything of value in life when that's the case? Let alone anything of real importance. Now take a look at if the mind is withdrawing or retracting, where you're stuck in your head all the time. Again, you are unable to accomplish anything other than to stroke your own ego and feed it to where it reaches unsustainable levels, to where it controls your mind and you fail to do so. It, your ego, lives your life while you unknowingly take a back seat. You cannot be living a fully engaged life when these things are present. And then we have to understand if our mind is suffering from delusion and ignorance. And by ignorance here, it doesn't mean that someone is stupid. It means you don't know what you don't know. And delusion, of course, is part of that idea of all of the stories that the ego is constantly making up. We're living life through the eyes of the ego. And most of what we have is based on our identity of the ego. Most of what we know and accept as reality is based upon the identity of the ego. And those things serve to keep us from having any sense of awakening, let alone live the happy life that we deserve. The same goes if our mind is giving way to hatred and anger or greed. When these things are controlling our mind, we are certainly not living a fully engaged life. Likewise, we come to understand how and why many of our thoughts arise. We get to understand how the mind actually operates. We get to understand that many of our emotions are the byproduct of thought instead of something we're truly feeling. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. The practices contained within mindfulness are giving us kind of an owner's manual for our mind. And this manual is the best, most complete manual that I have been able to come across. I have not found anything better, and I have searched various cultures and dozens upon dozens of systems, and nothing I have found is as complete and as comprehensive as the practices contained within mindfulness. So if you're looking to unlock your true potential, this is the path. This will allow you to do it. My wonderful wife and I were just discussing this the other night, and that's one of the things that I had expressed to her about these teachings, that the practices of mindfulness have had the greatest life-changing impact on me and my overall life out of anything that I have studied. These things changed my life because they changed me as I went through the practices. And I cannot express how much I treasure this system, how much I cherish each and every one of these practices. Because without this, I would not be living the life I'm living now. And I really, really love the life I have now. And that is why I'm sharing this with all of you, my friends, because I want you to love your life too. So I will leave you with this question. If I am my mind, if I am the thoughts and emotions in my mind, then who is it that is becoming mindfully aware of my mind as it thinks and creates emotions? And remember, the actual authentic practices offer you a way to directly experience the answer to that question for yourself. You're not going to try to borrow someone else's knowledge or try to figure it out by allowing the mind to retract back in and just try and think and figure it out. But it allows you to actually directly experience that answer for yourself. And in so doing, you get to experience the truth of it. And remember, this helps create the very foundation that allows us to live a fully engaged life. Please remember to stop by www.expansionmastery.com, grab an autographed copy of Expansion Mastery, the practical guide to living a fully engaged life, as well as check out some of the other goodies there. And there's much more to come very soon. And most of all, make sure that you are sharing these podcasts. I appreciate seeing every one of you do that. Thank you so very much. You are greatly appreciated. And if we can help anyone else to enjoy these teachings and to awaken a little bit right now, it is extremely important. So that's fantastic if we can have even just a small role that we get to play in that. Until next time, my friends, I wish you the very best in all of your practices and your life. Take care.